So we've reached task 5 of chapter 4. And this is page 75 of the report, 79 electronically. So just as a reminder, the question here is, how many chronic HCV 10-year survivors would have survived to the end of 2019, assuming no excess risk from HCV? And I just want to see if I can put in probably in oversimplistic terms why this is a stage in the process. Is it right to understand you asked this question because you can't assume that everyone who has hepatitis C and has reached this stage will die from hepatitis C? There will be general hazards faced by the population based on age and sex alone. And there may also be implications from whatever condition it might have given rise to a need for transfusion, although that's obviously very variable. Is that right in broad terms?
So there is, first of all, the age and gender specific risk of dying. In addition to that, for 10-year survivors post-transfusion, even if they were not hepatitis C infected, there might be a residual transfusion risk that adds to the expected mortality during 11 to 15 years post-transfusion and during 16 to 20 years post-transfusion. There was some information from Scandinavia to the effect that there were residual transfusion risks, and there was some hint that those risks might themselves be age-dependent. And so we're very grateful to the inquiry for the support that it gave to Scottish Blood Transfusion Service to set up a record linkage study of persons who had received blood transfusion in 1999, who were then followed forward by record linkage for 20 years. A 2004 cohort who were followed up for 15 years, and there are later cohorts as well. But we focused on the 1999 and 2004 cohorts, both of which would tell us what happened to 10-year survivors who were essentially not hepatitis C infected because they'd been transfused after the blood supply had been protected. And so we were able to compare the expected mortality in those cohorts at 11 to 15 years post-transfusion with the observed mortality. And there is a residual risk. And so if we might turn, I think it's, have I got the right page here?
Is it
figure it's appendix
4.9?
Table 2, page 142, I think. Is that right? Yes.
So
Page 142,
146,
thank you. And so if we ignore age group and say the additional hazard post-transfusion is common across all of the age groups for the 10-year survivors, then that additional hazard is a hazard ratio of 1.7.
We should explain hazard.
Oh, right. Well, I thought, yeah, so essentially their observed deaths were 1.7 times as many as the expected deaths during that period. And from 16 to 20 years, those who survived were alive after 15 years after transfusion, looking at what happened to them during the subsequent 5 years. Again, there was an increased risk of dying compared to what would be expected if it were just the general population mortality for their age and gender.
So we must apologise for using, well, I wouldn't call it jargon, it just is the term, the official term for the annual risk of dying is known as the hazard. It's a archaic name that's given. And so when we give an additional hazard or a hazard ratio, sometimes it's called, of 1.32, it just means that your annual risk of dying is multiplied by 1.32 or 32, or 1/3 extra risk of dying each year. So whenever the hazard is, I'm afraid, a term we do use because it is the, but best just to think of it as the annual risk of dying.
And if we just go back to the text of the report, which deals with task 5, so page 75, electronic 79, I'll just ask you a couple of questions arising out of the paragraph 4.102. So this is the SNBTS record linkage study you referred to. Is it right to understand that that's the principal source of data on which you relied for this exercise?
It is indeed.
Just a couple of points in relation to it. The first is, we're told here that for the 1999 cohort, that represented 3 large teaching hospitals across Scotland and 1 large general hospital. Might that run the risk of skewing the data towards more major surgery requiring transfusions, and hence potentially a greater risk of a longer-lasting hazard or additional hazard from transfusion?
I think probably not. The hospitals were actually in the north, on the east coast of Scotland, so going up Edinburgh, Dundee, Aberdeen, and for the 2004 cohort, I think they included Regmore Hospital in Inverness. So I think they are not, I mean, they're tertiary hospitals, but I expect them to be reasonably representative. But those were the data that we had, and they represented about 40% of the population of Scotland, because essentially it was the east and northeast coast rather than the west coast of Scotland.
And then just a second point arising out of that data. So if you're looking at transfusions from 1999 onwards for this cohort, is that it?
No,
that's right?
no, they were persons who were transfused in 1999, and we follow them up for mortality up to the end of 2019. So we have 20 years of follow-up.
And the inquiry understands from other evidence it's heard that the practices in relation to transfusion changed over the decades. But certainly 1999 is a period where one has national initiatives in relation to better blood transfusion. So that it might be said that what you're getting if you look at people transfused in 1999 are people who are only receiving transfusions because they really need them, perhaps more serious underlying condition, and hence an impact upon hazard that you wouldn't get for those who might have received transfusions, say, in the 1980s when the practice was, particularly for women giving birth, let's just top them up. Is that a relevant factor?
It is a potential factor that these hazards of residual effect of transfusion could be higher when you are if you are concentrating the transfusions on higher need, as it were. There may be higher residual transfusion effects. That is possible. On the other hand, the majority, as we know, of people who are transfused are 60 plus at the time of transfusion. So, and a high proportion of those, of course, will have died by the time, before they reach 10 years post-transfusion. So as we go into the second decade post-transfusion, we are shifting focus, if you like, in general, to younger survivors.
And then just to understand where we see this produced in tabular form, well, if we go first of all to page 76 of the report, so electronic 80, yes. Paragraph 4.106, okay. You tell us there that the transfusion-adjusted hazard rates are applied to the output from Task 4 to give estimated numbers of survivors to the end of 2019, both without and with allowance for the excess mortality of being post-transfusion. And then you tell us it gives rise to columns B and C of table 4.13, which is page 78.
If I might just
yes.
talk you briefly through this figure.
Absolutely.
I realise that it might need a wet towel around the head. But if you look at the lower panel for the males and focus on the year of transfusion 1990, my reading of colours isn't so great, so I'm just looking at the third line up. And without the additional transfusion hazard on the left-hand panel, you see that that third line up, they're about 50%, bit under 50%, 45% are surviving still at 2019, if you don't assume additional transfusion hazards. And now if you shift to the panel, still for males, but on the right-hand side, you'll see that the proportion surviving has dropped to be about halfway down between 0.5 and 0.25. So that's the impact of allowing for the residual, a residual transfusion effect over and above the age-expected mortality. And if you go to the upper panel, you see that the women generally do better because survival rates, annual survival rates, are higher for women than for men.
And then if we go over to page 78, electronic 82, table 413. Again, can you just talk us through how this table then is your answer to task 5?
Yes. So if we look at somebody at the bottom, just above the total line, somebody whose year of transfusion was 1991, if they're a 10-year survivor, they've survived to 2001. And then we're saying how the next column is telling me the estimated number chronically infected 10-year survivors who've survived to 10 years post-transfusion, who received their transfusion in 1991 and thereby are surviving to 2001. There were 250. And then the estimated number, thank you, the estimated number of those chronically infected who survive through to 2019, assuming no post-transfusion excess risk, would be 130. But if we assume an excess transfusion risk, the central estimate drops to 120, but with that uncertainty that carries forward from all of the numbers. So what we have in the total line is just the yellow line summed over all of the past years. So that, of course, if somebody had their year of transfusion in 1970, would have been a 10-year survivor in 1980, we're expecting that 120 would be 10-year survivors, but the number of those who made it through to 2019 because of the natural force of mortality plus the excess transfusion-related risk would be only 30.
And then is column D essentially the answer to task 6?
Yes.
It is, yes.
So if we just go back to the previous
So
page.
actually,
yes.
could be just as another way to explain it, that it means that we estimate in England there are 6,700 people infected through blood transfusions who survived 10 years following their transfusion. And then, from then until 2019, 4,000 essentially died of, you could say, natural causes, due to the inevitable risk. Another 200 died because of their being post-transfusion, and another 300 died because of being hepatitis C infected.
And so if we go to the previous page, just to talk through task 6.
Yeah.
So of those infected with chronic HCV through transfusion between 1970 and August 1991, how many died of HCV-related causes by 2019? And then you've set out in paragraph 4.109 reference to a study which I think is the basis then for the hazard ratio of 1.53.
That's
Could
correct.
you talk us through that?
So the people who are part of this study had all received HCV-implicated transfusions. So they were identified through the look-back studies that were done from 1995 onwards. And 924 of those patients who were traced, cancelled and offered testing, were hepatitis C antibody positive, of whom I think it's about 600 or so are RNA positive, and some 443 patients had received an implicated transfusion but were not infected. By an implicated transfusion, we mean the donor was had been found to be hepatitis C infected. We don't know whether the donor was infected at the time of all of those past transfusions, which is partly why we have controls. So you have the cases who are RNA positive and the controls. They are alike in the sense that they were transfused at roughly the same time. They are alike in the sense that they had to have survived long enough to be traced and cancelled by the look-back study. So mostly they will have survived throughout the first 10 years of their post-transfusion period. But they are alike in the transfusion-related risks and the natural expected mortality that applies to the general population. So over and above that is the hazard associated with their having infectious hepatitis C. And that hazard was estimated basically within the 21st century, and gives a hazard ratio of 1.53, but with a confidence interval from 1.2 to 2. Now, Professor Spiegelhalter has a very nice way of explaining this, 1.53, but essentially that is the increase in all-cause mortality, because as we've discussed before, we now understand that infectious hepatitis C doesn't just affect the liver, but can affect heart, kidneys, brain. And so the better measure of the impact is on all-cause mortality. Dave,
So,
do you want to
yeah,
explain
I'd just like to
1.5?
again point to the study being so remarkable in that it is a problem to work out what is the overall effect of having chronic hepatitis C infection, because there are so many aspects, risk factors associated with having that reason for having that infection in the first place. And so being able to, since match people who are chronically hepatitis C infected with people who, as Professor Bird pointed out, are similar in all other ways, is a remarkable achievement, and allows us to feel that this is a good estimate, if rather uncertain. And again, has been emphasised, this is all-cause mortality. We're not restricted to causes of death that have been officially linked to hepatitis C. Just to say, a hazard ratio of 1.53 means that each year your risk of death is 50% higher than it would have been had you not got the hepatitis C infection. Incidentally, that's about the hazard ratio of being male instead of female. And but it does mean that, for example, of every 2 deaths you would have expected normally, that since it's a 50% extra risk, you would have 3 deaths instead of 2 in that group. And that means essentially that of every 3 deaths that occur in that group, 1 is linked to the chronic hepatitis C infection. And it's from that, the fact that we can enable to say, we just look at all the deaths in that group and attribute 1/3 on average to the chronic hepatitis C infection. And that's why there's 1/3 figure, 1/3 of all the deaths reported in this group. Now, after 10 years post-transfusion, we attribute to hepatitis C, with the uncertainty attached to it. That's why the bounds around that figure are quite large. But it is, quite a, in a way, simple way of describing that 1 in 3 deaths in that group are due to hepatitis C.
And then in relation specifically to the study that you relied on for the purposes of the estimated hazard ratio 1.53 described in paragraph 4.109, there's a handful of questions I've been asked to ask you on behalf of call participants in relation to that. So first of all, is it right to understand that the hazard ratio that you've identified is essentially solely based upon this particular study?
That is correct. And again, we were grateful to the inquiry and to colleagues, including Professor D'Angelis, who've been involved with this study for the later record linkage follow-up, which essentially doubled the amount of information in the study and this analysis produced. But it's also relevant to mention that for the most part, these patients lived through the era of improving treatments for hepatitis C. So that, for instance, people who were hepatitis C chronically infected in the 1970s might have been subject to a higher hazard ratio than we here represent for those patients who were essentially picked up recruited into the study in the late 1990s.
Well, I think that in fact feeds into the second point which I've been asked to explore with you, which was whether, because these are patients identified through look-back.
Correct.
And I think you've told us elsewhere in the report the look-back succeeded to the extent that it did in identifying more recent transfusion recipients rather than ones from earlier in the relevant period.
Yes.
So would it be right to understand that the patients picked up in this study may have been less likely to be burdened with long periods of untreated hepatitis C or untreated cirrhosis, perhaps, than others who have been infected in the 70s and 80s?
I would think that is a fair assessment.
And again, there may have been implications in terms of the treatment that they received.
Yes, the treatments that were available in the 1990s, the interferon-based treatments, had a much lower success rate in terms of sustained virological clearance, and they were much more difficult to tolerate as treatments than the directly acting antiretroviral therapy that came into being in the last decade. And
so is it reasonable to make the assumption that there should be a constant hazard ratio over the 3 decades, given that this cohort is people who may have been picked up more recently?
It's a reasonable assumption for the patients who were picked up in this case control study, but as we've discussed, the hazard may be higher for those who were hepatitis C infected in earlier times, for whom, sadly, we do not have corresponding information. But we can be pretty clear that the direction of the effect would be a higher hazard.
And the study referred to here, again, I've been asked, you've explained that you were granted access to the results ahead of publication. Is this a study that's now being published or is likely to be published soon, do you know?
I don't believe it's been published as yet, but it is a very critical study, and I'm sure will be being prepared for publication.
Well, we can no doubt pick that up elsewhere. And then if we just go back before we leave chapter 4 to the table on page 50.
Thank you. David, do you want to do this one?
Shall I do them?
Do you want to talk us through this?
Yes. As I said, our actual modelling exercise came up with the top row, which we've been through this afternoon. 22,000 infected in England, 18,000 chronically infected, of which nearly 7,000 survived 10 years post-transfusion. And the interesting figure here perhaps is this column, chronically infected survived to end of 2019, assuming the extra hepatitis C risk. So that's 2,200 alive in England in 2019 with chronic hepatitis C post-transfusion, and 1,500 of whom have died because of the hepatitis C. And again, from the preceding discussion, if anything, that would be an underestimate. And when added up over the UK, we get the total figures with 1,800 deaths due to hepatitis C. As we mentioned, the Wales and Northern Ireland figures are purely extrapolations from England according to the population, whereas the Scottish figures have been subject to as much Scottish dependent data as we can in terms of the, right from the beginning, in terms of the likelihood of infection and so on. But the effect of being chronically hepatitis C infected in terms of mortality has been assumed for everyone.
And then just a general question now, but in relation to hepatitis C and data for hepatitis C. In terms of the available data for hepatitis C, the uncertainty that is created by limitations in data, is that typical across infectious diseases as a whole, or is the lack of data for hepatitis C more obvious more than normal?
There is actually very good hepatitis C epidemiology. As people will be aware, one of the major groups infected was injecting drug users. And their progression of hepatitis C and the impacts on their mortality have been studied quite intensively. They are also a group who is young at the age of infection, whereas those who become chronically hepatitis C infected through transfusion are typically substantially older at the time of their infection. They have a much fiercer force of mortality just because of their age, plus the effects of transfusion. And the effects of transfusion, the ability to survive 10 years post-transfusion, even without hepatitis C infection, is even harsher than the ability to survive 10 years as an injecting drug user. So there is good study, there has been substantial study of the impact of hepatitis C, but generally in a younger population than the people who've been infected through blood transfusion.
And so would then it be right to understand the key data deficiencies then relate to, in particular, the earlier stages of the model that we were discussing? There is no database which gives numbers of individuals infected through transfusion with hepatitis C. And then there are all the uncertainties in relation to the available data about transfusion, about the degree of infectivity prior to screening. Those are where the data omissions are, is that right?
That's correct. In principle, you can look at what happens to those who were infected through hepatitis C and were diagnosed and compare the diagnosis register against the death register for those whose route of infection. But we suspect that quite a number of people, as shown here, quite a number of people who were infected would not necessarily have lived long enough for their hepatitis C to have been diagnosed.
And then moving away from hepatitis C back to HIV, but now a general question again about the availability of data. HIV/AIDS has never been a notifiable disease. Has that contributed to limitations in terms of the available data?
I would suggest not, that making a disease, particularly one about which there was a lot of fear and initially stigma, notifiable, potentially risks that people don't come forward for diagnosis and they don't therefore get care in the way that would be beneficial, so that as soon as you're diagnosed, even if the clinician doesn't have the wherewithal to help immediately, they at least have you under care, as it were, so that you can get treatment as and when it becomes available. So often in public health, we don't consider that making a disease, an infectious disease, notifiable necessarily helps with the registration process. We want to encourage diagnosis, and part of the way to encourage diagnosis is to ensure that registers are confidential, so that they're indexed on a no names basis. So you can have something that's called the soundex of the surname rather than Bird. B630 is the soundex of my surname. You ignore vowels and letters that sound the same get the same numerical code. So in Bird, B, I you ignore, R, the numerical code for that is 6. D and T, because they sound alike, are coded 3. And because I have a short surname, then there's a trailing 0. But a name like Bert or Bard or Board, which I hope you're not, would all code to B630. So seeing SB630 wouldn't tell you it's Sheila Bird. And that can help to encourage the medical confidentiality of diagnosis registers, and that together with gender and date of birth is a sufficient identifier for probabilistic linkage to the deaths register.
I won't ask how we sound code Professor Spiegelhalter is doing. Two final questions from me for now. The first is, going back to something you said earlier, Professor Bird, about I said I wasn't going to go through Chapter 5 and the funds and the data available from the funds, but you mentioned the importance of calibration, and so could I perhaps ask you just to address that point?
Yes, if we might turn, sorry, I get this bit, to page 179 and table 5.5. So this is just for England, and we're grateful to a team at DHSC and who were familiar with the EBIS data and its predecessors. And we obtained an estimate. There are a couple of steps in obtaining this sort of estimate of the number of beneficiaries who were known to be alive at the 31st of December 2014, really before the switchover of the funds, and also at around the time of the start of directly acting antiretroviral therapy. And so here we're showing by your age band at the 31st of December 2014, the number from our baseline stochastic model for England, the number of males that we expected to be surviving at the 31st of December 2014 who had been chronically HCV infected, so that in the 30 to 39-year-old people who were 30 to 39 at 31st of December 2014, our model expected 220, but with an uncertainty interval from 150 to 330, whereas the number recognized by the fund seemed to be 27, so a substantial undercount. And similarly, for the females, if the yellow line continues across. Now, these people would obviously have been quite young at the time that they had their transfusion. And so, indeed, they would have been children. And so, it may well be that they and their families didn't know or didn't remember about transfusions, and there looks, relative to our model, to be an undercount. Whereas if you drop down to those who at December 31st, 2014 were 50 to 59 or 60 to 69, the ages at which you might expect hepatitis C to be expressing itself rather vigorously, we expected for the males a total of around 300, but with an uncertainty interval from about 200 to 470, more or less. And the observed numbers were also coincidentally, it's an accident that happened to match exactly, but were 300. So that where you would expect epidemiologically the disease to have been vigorously expressed, we take in a sense some comfort that there is some agreement between our baseline model and what the funds know about. The agreement is less good for the women, and you mentioned earlier those who might have received transfusion in the context of childbirth. So whereas roughly there is equality for the males, the women, only about 50% of the women are represented in the fund that we had projected might have reached that point. So we were looking for what we saw for the males 50 to 69, that where there was reasonable agreement. The other aspects of the table are that for younger people, there may be an undercount that one might want to try to do something about because they are young enough to benefit from early intervention if recognized.
And just as a summary, if we look along the bottom row, it suggests that of the alive beneficiaries, you roughly double that to get our estimates of how many are actually alive. So for every known beneficiary, there's someone out in the population who is not yet registered.
And then the last question I wanted to ask for now, in any event, is just in relation to any recommendations or thoughts you have about how data collection could be improved. And by all means, if you don't have those thoughts now, but want to share them with the inquiry at a later stage, that's not a problem. But if, given that a theme of the evidence today has been areas where data is missing or incomplete or problematic, I wanted to give you an opportunity to provide us with any thoughts you have on how that could be improved.
I'd just like to make the point that things have obviously improved greatly. I think if we were running this now about current data, we would not be relying on faxes with little handwritten remarks on them. I think the COVID pandemic has shown that with will, data can be made available, research, and I don't know, maybe Stephen might want to say something about the ability now to, while respecting confidentiality, do some extremely sophisticated work with available data. So I'm not saying things are perfect at all, but since the period that we're looking at, which is up to 50 years ago, there have been huge improvements.
I think in terms of transfusion medicine, the support that the inquiry gave, for example, to the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service to have record linkage of 5-yearly cohorts is really valuable to know how transfusions are used on an ongoing basis, and I think that would be something that would be worth continuing. One of the difficulties, as you'll be aware, is that we knew something about, well, we knew quite well the prevalence of hepatitis C once testing started in 1991, but there were not stored samples that had been stored in any systematic way, even on a sample basis, for past years. And sadly, it is likely that in the future there may be another virus that is bloodborne. And so we want to think, how could we be in a better position? And that might be something to consider. In terms of the funds, I think any sort of database needs really to be properly managed and analyzable. And so there's almost a case for putting academic rigor or scientific rigor into how those fund databases are managed. They need support to do that. It's not a trivial matter to get these things right, and so that could be something of importance. I think it's also really valuable to recognize the work that was done really well for variant CJD and the cross-linkage So we talked earlier about those databases that weren't cross-referenced, and that has to be done with due respect to the confidentiality of individuals. But in important areas, the case for public benefit can be made and perhaps should be. And I suppose one of the databases that might merit the sort of support would be the National Haemophilia Database, in the same sort of way as there is support for the outcomes of solid organ transplantation, and there has been from the early 1980s, and those databases are really well managed and regularly analysed. There may be a case that people with bleeding disorders have been vulnerable to past infections, and we cannot guarantee that there won't be further bloodborne infections. And so putting in place at least rigour so that you can feel confident that you know what has gone on. That's probably enough from me, but there are one or two other things, but that
Anything,
might suffice.
Professor Evans, to add?
Yes, I would just add that the Goldacre review has set out criteria for a trusted research environment, because much of the barrier has been confidentiality and a reluctance, particularly in diseases with a stigma associated. But we now have technology to be able to do things that are rather better in preserving patient confidentiality while being able to do proper analyses. And so, for example, had there been linkage between transfusion with a date and a time and the potential for a linkage back to the donor that was then linked into the general practice record rather than simply into a hospital record possibly, and done so inadequately there, but linked into a general practice record, that would make our lives very much easier. Now, it may well be that there will be moves along those lines to incorporate that sort of data in the future. I don't think I would want to do anything now, and I'd be reluctant to offer my colleagues more work, but I wonder whether it would be reasonable for us to at least consider providing you with something that answers your question with a little more thought than just off the cuff.
Absolutely. So those are the questions I'm currently proposing to ask, but we obviously need to give core participants an opportunity to suggest further lines of question. I've fed in some core participant questions, but I'm conscious I've had more in the course of the day as well that I've not had a chance to look at.
Well, I imagine that the nature of the evidence will give rise potentially to a number of questions. So we will need to give time, as you say, to those who represent core participants to formulate those questions and allow you to consider asking them. Now, that's going to take time. How much time do you think you might need?
I'm going to suggest, sir, that we come back at 5 o'clock.
Okay. Not before 5 o'clock, then we shall meet again. The reason I use that formulation, not before, is because if there are more questions than are anticipated, it'll take longer, obviously, to field them. So not before 5 o'clock. I can't promise you how long we will be after that. I'm very grateful for your time thus far, and indeed for the last suggestion that you made, Professor Evans, volunteering yourself and those others for work. Very gratefully accepted.
I haven't got consent, but...
Oh, I saw them nodding.